Hey, my name is Martin, I write software, and today I'd like to talk about what can go wrong when we're working under time pressure. I think this should be interesting to just anyone in the industry. It's a very common problem, and if you learn a bit about some of the mechanisms and behaviors that take place when you're working to a deadline, it'll help you know what to watch out for and how to avoid some of the more common mistakes. Now, you might be thinking, well, aren't we always working under time pressure? And that's kind of true, but what I wanted to talk about is what happens when there's more of that pressure than usual. So let's get started. I divided the topic into three major areas, and the first one I'd like to go into is communication, how we talk to each other, how information flows. You'll see information about change not really flowing that well. A common example of this is the backend team implements an API, goes to the UI people and says, hey, here's the API you wanted. And they'll come back and say, well, we're not doing that anymore, because you'll waste a lot of work. You'll probably see requirements that are poorly described, or at least not as good as they used to. It happens a lot when you change a feature or swap one to another. And previously, maybe you had all of the screens designed and had a nice specification. And now you're working out of a mock-up and a verbal description of what this is supposed to do. And this is really kind of acting without thinking. There's a high chance of you having to redo this at a later stage when somebody looks at the whole product and says, well, this doesn't make sense. We didn't think about that, right? Some other things that might come up, decisions become more isolated. People who should have been in the room or should have been in the chat thread where decisions are made, they're not there, but they have to pay some of the cost of some of the outcome of that decision. And priorities become less clear. Some of the time you're working hard towards the deadline because you're really trying to do three things when you only have time to do one. And if there are three competing priorities, it makes it really hard to make the right decisions. So why do these things happen? One factor is that if you tell somebody they need to do something really quickly, and especially if that person is an engineer, well, they're going to be like, okay, fine, I will focus really hard on my coding. And they'll exclude all other distractions. And most engineers will think that talking to other people, meetings, that those are distractions. So they'll want to cut that out. That leads to some of these problems around like updates not flowing well, about the backend team and front end team not talking to each other anymore. And another thing that might happen is people will feel like their problems are smaller than everybody else's. They'll see that, oh, everybody else is fighting this big scary deadline. I'm trying to help, but maybe I'll just try and deal with my issues here on the side by myself. And that might lead to some of these bigger roadblocks just not getting raised at all or getting raised late. And finally, under time pressure, people are a little bit more snappy, and that just makes it a little bit harder to talk to them. So you might think that, hey, I'll just tell my manager that I've got a problem, and then you'll see that he's a bit stressed, and you'll think like, well, maybe I'll tell him later. And obviously you never do. So what can we do about this? What are some of the strategies to use here? Well, in my experience, the first thing to look at is if you had some sort of communication process set up in the past, just make sure that that's still working, right? If you were doing daily stand-ups, keep doing those daily stand-ups. Don't try and save 15 minutes by removing those. If you were writing a weekly update to tell what you've been up to all of the other teams that depend on your work, like keep doing that. They'll expect it. Maybe even do more of that, do it more frequently. Set expectations that because you're in a rush, bad stuff is going to happen, and it's okay for it to happen. Maybe have a person who's designated to deal with all of this. Ideally, that would be a project manager, but it could be somebody else. And just say that, hey, it's their job to hear about all the bad stuff that's going on and figure out what to do with it. Try and make your priorities as simple as possible. Don't go and say, well, we need to do this and that and that. Just ideally make it one thing. Focus on giving objective updates to make sure that everybody has a clear idea of what's going on. If you're giving somebody an estimate, just be clear that it's an estimate, maybe give them a range. And more is usually better. So if you're wondering whether to tell somebody about something or not, just go and tell them. They'll let you know if you're giving them too many updates, which in my experience almost never happens. Last thing, use whatever tools you've been using up until now. Usually that'll be a ticketing system of some sort. So, if you're starting working on a ticket, go and indicate that you're working on that ticket. There's probably a comment field in there. Use that to let people know that you've made a certain amount of progress or that you've hit some issues. And that'll really help everybody know what's going on. The second thing I'd like to talk about is code quality. Again, a lot of stuff might happen here. You'll probably spend less time on architecture and refactoring, and you'll end up missing the right abstractions a little bit later, and that'll introduce additional complexity in your code. This mostly becomes an issue if everybody's working in the same area. So if you're trying to build like a whole feature in a very small amount of time, this is going to be especially painful because the complexity of the code will grow up very, very, very quickly. Whereas if you're just adding a little bit of code here and there, you might be able to avoid this one. You'll probably spend less time writing tests. Under time pressure, people will still add automated tests, but they're going to be very minimal, and you'll rely a little bit more on maybe testing things manually. And that'll naturally lead to more bugs in the code. I've not seen anybody update their documentation when they're rushing, and so you're probably not going to do that either. And this one, is usually okay-ish. Like, new people won't be able to ramp up as well. And whatever you were using your documentation for in the past, well, you can't use it anymore, so that's going to be a bit of a hassle. The last one is all these little undocumented hacks that later on nobody really knows what they do and why they were added. And they usually have some sort of comment like, I don't know why this is needed, or haha, very helpful, right? So that's definitely a ticking time bomb that you'll have to address at some point, or you're just going to have a no-go zone in your code base that like, don't touch this or it will break. And those are not fun. If you're thinking, well, that's all just adding loads of tech debt, yeah, you're right. That's just tons and tons of tech debt that you will probably have to add to make sure that you're doing something faster than you would normally be able to. There really isn't the way to make this magically disappear. Either you're going to dedicate time to fix all of this after you've shipped whatever thing you needed to ship quickly. And this is not going to be cheap. Or you will have to push back on some of the schedule and say that, well, instead of doing more things faster, we'll just do fewer things. So that really is up to you, and you will have to negotiate your way through that. The third thing that tends to happen when you're working under time pressure is that people will stay longer in the office, work longer hours. And I don't really think that that's such a great strategy. And what I found is that the extra hours at the end of the day are not that effective. And you rarely have any good ideas at the end of a long day when you're tired. And work tends to expand to the amount of time you give it. So if you're deciding that you're going to have a longer day, usually the work you would have done anyway will just stretch to fit that. Some of the reasons why I've stayed longer in the past were, simple ones, like peer pressure. I saw other people working longer, and I felt like as part of a team, you have to do the same, right? And sometimes I just want to live up to my word. I said that something will take a week, and then, it was more complicated, so I felt like I had to work longer to make sure that it gets done within that week. And sometimes you just feel like whatever you're working on is so important, so crucial to the product that it really needs to happen. And so you'll work as much as you need to make that happen. And with time, what I found is if you feel a lot of peer pressure, sometimes it just makes sense to have a good reason to leave. Like you need to catch your train, you need to catch your bus. I don't know, you need to feed your dog, right? Like there are loads of reasons people have for leaving on time. So just pick one and stick to it. If you feel like you're really committed to that estimate, you said, hey, it'll take a week. The best way to do that, to move forward, is just to improve your estimates in the future. I haven't seen CFOs take money out of their bank account whenever the company fails to make the amount of earnings that they thought they would. So why are you doing the same thing with your time? And if you think that what you're working on is so important, well, look at all the stuff that you thought is super important in the past, like a lot of the times you won't even remember those things. There's this like huge bias that you have towards what you're working on right now that makes it feel like it's super critical. A lot of the time it's just not. It just seems that way to you. I want to finish with a small caveat. Throughout my career, I've worked as a full-time employee, and in all my contracts, my overtime was free. So that's some of the reason why I have this perspective. If you're a contractor, maybe you love overtime, so take some of this advice with a pinch of salt. Communications falling apart, code quality taking a dive, and people working really long hours are the top 3 problems I've seen when working under time pressure. But I'm curious to hear about your experiences. What's your worst or best crunch time story? What other topics do you want to hear about? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you want to see more videos like this one, then click like and subscribe. Thanks. See you in the next one.